Although every word of this story is as true as despair, I don't expect you to believe it. Nowadays, a rational explanation is required before belief is possible, isn't it? Let me then at once offer the rational explanation, which finds most favour amongst those who have heard the tale of my life's tragedy. It is held that we were under a delusion, Laura and I, on that 31st of October, and that this supposition places the whole matter on a satisfactory and believable basis. Well, yeah, you can judge for yourselves when you've heard my story how far this is an explanation and in what sense it is rational. There were three who took part in this, Laura and I and another man. The other man still lives, and he can speak to the truth of at least the credible part of my story. I never in my life knew what it was to have as much money as I required to supply the most ordinary needs, good colours, books, cab fares. And when we were married, we knew quite well that we should only be able to live at all by strict punctuality and attention to business. I used to paint in those days, and Laura used to write, and we felt sure that between us, we could keep the pot at least simmering. Living in town, of course, was out of the question. So we went to look for a cottage in the country, something that was at once sanitary and picturesque. Now, so rarely do those two qualities meet in one cottage that our search was for some time quite fruitless. I mean, most of the residences that we looked at were lacking in both essentials. And when a cottage did chance to have drains, it also had stucco as well and was shaped like a tea caddy. And if we found a vine or rose-covered porch, corruption invariably lurked within. I mean, our minds, in fact, got so befogged by the eloquence of house agents and the rival disadvantages of the fever traps and outrages to beauty which we'd seen and scorned, that I doubt whether either of us on our wedding morning knew the difference between a house and a haystack. But when we got away from friends and house agents, when we were on our honeymoon, our wits grew clearer again, and we knew a pretty cottage when at last we saw it. It was at Brenzett, a little village set on a hill over against the Sutton marshes. We'd gone there from the seaside village where we were staying to see the church, and 2 fields from that church, we found the cottage. It stood by itself about 2 miles from the village, a long, low building with rooms sticking out in unexpected places. There was a bit of stonework, ivy covered and moss grown, just 2 old rooms, all that was left of a big house that had once stood there. And around this stonework, the cottage had grown up. I mean, stripped of its roses and jasmine, it would have probably been hideous. But as it stood, it was charming. And after a brief examination, we took it. I mean, it was absurdly cheap. The rest of our honeymoon was spent in grubbing about in second-hand shops in the county town, picking up bits of old oak and Chippendale chairs, and we wound up with a run up to town and a visit to Liberty's, and soon the low oak-beamed, lattice-windowed rooms began to feel like home. There was an old-fashioned garden with grass paths and no end of hollyhocks and sunflowers, and from the window you could see the marsh pastures, and beyond them the blue thin line of the sea. We were as happy there as that summer was glorious, and we settled down into work sooner than we expected ourselves. I never tired of sketching the view and the wonderful cloud effects from the open lattice, and Laura would sit at the table and write verses about them, in which I mostly played the part of foreground. We got a tall old local woman to do for us. Her cooking was of the home list, but she understood all about gardening, you see, and she told us all the old names of the coppices and cornfields, and stories of the smugglers and highwaymen, and of the things that walked, and the sights which met one in lonely glens on a starlight night. She was a comfort to us, was Mrs. Dorman, because Laura hated housekeeping as much as I loved folklore, and we soon came to leave all the domestic business to her, and to use her legends in little magazine stories which brought in the jingling guinea. We had 3 months of married happiness and not a single quarrel. One October evening, I'd been down to smoke a pipe with the doctor. He was our only neighbour, pleasant fellow. Laura had stayed at home to finish a comic sketch of some village episode or other. I'd left her laughing over her own jokes, but I came back to find her weeping in the window seat, a crumpled heap of pale muslin. "Good heavens, darling, what's the matter?" I said. She just leaned her head against my shoulder and went on crying. I mean, I'd never seen her cry before. We'd always been so happy together, and I felt sure that something serious must have happened. What's the matter, my love?" "It's Mrs. Dorman," she sobbed. "Well, what has Mrs. Dorman done?" I asked, rather relieved. "She says that she must go before the end of the month. She says her niece is ill, but I don't believe that that's the reason, because her niece is always ill. I think someone's been setting her against us. Her manner was so queer." She subsided into sobs again. "Oh, hey, look, Laura, darling, please, don't cry. Or I will have to cry too to keep you in countenance, and then you'll never respect me again." She dried her eyes on my handkerchief, and she even smiled faintly. "But you see, it really is serious," she went on, "because these village people, they're so sheepy, and if one of them won't do something, you may be quite sure that none of the others will either. And then you say, I'll have to cook all the dinners myself and wash up the plates, and you'll have to carry cans of water about and clean the boots and the knives. We'll never have any time to write or paint or earn any money. We'll have to work all day around the house and only be able to rest when we're waiting for the kettle to boil." I represented to her that even if we did have to perform all those duties ourselves, the day would still present some margin for other toils and recreations. But she just refused to see the matter in anything but the greyest light. "Look, listen, darling," I said, "I'll speak to Mrs. Dorman myself when she gets back and see if I can't come to terms with her, eh? I mean, perhaps she just wants a rise in her screw. It'll be all right. Come on, let's walk up to the church." Now, the church, it was a large and lonely one, and we loved to go up there, especially on the bright nights. The path skirted a wood, cut through it, and then ran along the crest of the hill through two meadows and round the churchyard wall, over which the old yews loomed in black masses of shadow. This path, which was paved for some of the way, was called the bier balk because it had long been the way by which the corpses had been carried to the churchyard for burial. Now, the churchyard itself was richly treed, shaded by great elms, and a large low porch let one into the building by a Norman doorway and a heavy oak door studded with iron. Inside, the arches rose into darkness, and between them the windows stood out white in the moonlight. In the chancel, these windows were of rich glass, which showed in faint light their noble colouring and made the black oak of the choir pews hardly more solid than the shadows. But on either side of the altar, you see, lay a grey marble figure of a knight in full plate armour, lying on a low slab with hands held up in everlasting prayer. And these figures, oddly enough, were always to be seen if there was any glimmer of light at all in the church. Now, their names were lost, but the peasants told of them that they had once been fierce and wicked men, marauders by land and sea, and had been guilty of deeds so foul that the house that they lived in, the big house that had stood on the site of our cottage, had been stricken by lightning and the vengeance of heaven. But, well, for all that, the gold of their heirs had bought them a place in the church. I mean, looking at the bad, hard faces reproduced in marble, this story was easy to believe. The church looked at its best and weirdest on that night that we were there, because the shadows of the yew trees fell through the windows upon the floor of the nave and touched the pillars with tattered shade. Laura and I, we sat down together without speaking, and we watched the solemn beauty of the church with some of that awe which inspired its early builders. We walked to the chancel, and looked at the sleeping warriors, and then we rested some time on the stone seat in the porch, looking out over the stretch of quiet moonlit meadows, feeling in every fibre of our being the peace of the night and happy love. And we came away at last with a sense that even scrubbing and cooking were but small troubles in the scheme of things. Now, Mrs. Dorman had come back from the village, and I at once invited her into my painting room for a tete-a-tete. Now, Mrs. Dorman, I said, what is all this about your wanting to leave us? I should be glad to get away, sir, before the end of the month, she answered with her usual placid dignity. Well, have you any fault to find, Mrs. Dorman? None at all, sir. You and your lady have always been most kind. Well, I'm sorry, what is it then? Are your wages not high enough? No, sir, I get quite enough. Well, then why not stay? I'd rather not, sir. My niece is ill. But I'm sorry, Mrs. Dorman, your niece has been ill ever since we came. No answer. There was a long and awkward silence. Well, look, Mrs. Dorman, perhaps you can stay for another month, I suggested. No, sir, I'm bound to go by Thursday. Thursday? Well, look, I think you might have let us know before, Mrs. Dorman. There's no time for us now to get anyone else before Thursday. I mean, can you really not stay till next week? I might be able to come back next week. Well, I was now convinced that all she wanted was a brief holiday, which we were doing perfectly willing to let her have as soon as we could get a substitute. But why must you go this week, Mrs. Dorman? I persisted. Come on, out with it, please. She drew her shawl, which she always wore, tightly across her bosom, as though she were suddenly cold. And then she said with an effort, they say, sir, as this was a big house in Catholic times, and there was many deeds done here. Now, the nature of these deeds might have been vaguely inferred from the inflection of Mrs. Dorman's voice, and I was glad that Laura was not in the room. Tell me about it, Mrs. Dorman, please. You needn't mind telling me. I shan't laugh at you. Well, sir, you may have seen in the church, beside the altar, two shapes. Well, you mean the effigies of knights in armour? I mean, sir, them two bodies drawn out man-size in marble, she returned, and I had to admit that her description was 1,000 times more graphic than mine. They do say, as on All Saints' Eve, that them two bodies sits up on their slabs and gets off of them and then walks down the aisle in their marble. And as the church clock strikes 11, they walks out of the church door and over the graves and along the bier balk, and if it's a wet night, there's the marks of their feet in the morning. And where do they go? I asked. They comes back here to their home, sir, if anyone meets them. What if anyone meets them? But no, not another word could I get from her, save that her niece was ill and she must go on Thursday. Well, after what I'd heard, I refused to discuss the niece any further, and I tried to get from Mrs. Dorman more details of this legend, but I could get nothing but warnings. Whatever you do, sir, lock the door early on All Saints' Eve, and make the cross sign over the doorstep and all the windows. But has anyone ever seen these things, Mrs. Dorman? I persisted. That's not for me to say, sir. I know only what I know. Well, who was here last year? No one, sir. The lady who's owned the house only stayed here in the summer, and she always went to London a full month before the night. And I'm sorry to inconvenience you and your lady, but my niece is ill, and I must go on Thursday. Well, I could have shaken her for absurd reiteration of that obvious fiction about the niece after she'd already told me her real reasons. But no, she was determined to go, nor could any of my entreaties move her in the least. I didn't tell Laura the legend of the shapes that walked in their marble, as Mrs. Dorman had put it, partly because a legend concerning our house might upset her. And, well, Partly, I think, well, it didn't seem quite the same to me as Mrs. Dorman's other stories seemed, and I didn't want to talk about it until the day was over. Well, as promised, she left on the Thursday. She did relent a little at parting, so far as to say, "Don't you put yourself out too much, ma'am, and if there's any little thing I can do next week, I'm sure that I shan't mind to do it." From which I inferred that she wished to come back to us after Halloween. But up until last, she adhered to the fiction of her niece with touching fidelity. Well, Thursday passed off pretty well. Laura, in fact, showed marked ability in the matter of steak and potatoes, and I confess that my knives and the plates, which I insisted upon watching, were better done than I dared to expect. And then Friday came. And oh dear. I mean, I wonder if I should have believed this myself if anyone had told it to me. I'll tell the story as quickly and plainly as I can. Everything that happened on that day is burnt into my brain, and I shall not forget anything nor leave anything out. I got up early, and I had just lighted the kitchen fire when Laura came running downstairs, as sunny and sweet as the clear October morning itself. We prepared breakfast together. The housework was soon done, and when brushes and brooms and pails were quiet again, the house was still indeed. We spent the day sorting and dusting our books, and we dined on cold steak and coffee. I mean, Laura was, if anything, brighter and sweeter than usual, and I began to think that, in fact, a little domestic toil was perhaps rather good for her. We'd never been so merry since we were married, and the walk that we had that afternoon was, I think, the happiest time of my entire life. When we'd watched the deep scarlet clouds slowly pale into leaden grey and seen the white mists curl up along the hedgerows in the distant marsh, we came back to the house silently, hand in hand. "You're sad, my darling," I said, half jestingly, as we sat down together in our little parlour. I mean, I expected a disclaimer for my own silence. It had been the silence of complete happiness. But to my surprise, she said, "Yes, I think I am sad, Jack. Or rather uneasy. I don't think I'm very well. I've shivered 3 or 4 times since we came in, and it's not cold, is it?" "No," I said, and I hoped that it wasn't a chill that she'd caught from those mists that roll up from the marshes in the dying light. But no, she said she didn't think it was that. Then after a silence, she spoke suddenly. "Do you ever have presentiments of evil?" "No," I said, and I shouldn't believe in them if I had. "Well, I do. The night my father died, I knew it, although he was far away in the north of Scotland." Well, I just didn't say anything. She sat looking at the fire for some time in silence, gently stroking my hand, and then suddenly she sprang up, came behind me, and drawing my head back, she kissed me. "It's over now, darling. Oh, what a baby I am. Come on, light the candles and we'll have some of these new Rubinstein duets." And so we spent a happy hour or 2 at the piano. At about 10:30, I began to long for the goodnight pipe. But Laura, you see, looked so white that I felt it'd be brutal of me to fill our sitting room with tobacco fumes. "I'll smoke outside tonight, darling," I said. "Let me come too." No, sweetheart, not tonight. Well, you're tired. I won't be long. You get to bed, or I shall have an invalid to nurse tomorrow, as well as the boots to clean." Well, I kissed her and was turning to go when she flung her arms around my neck and held me as if she'd never let me go again. I stroked her hair. "You're tired, my love. Just rest." She loosened her clasp a little and drew a deep breath. "We've been very happy today, Jack, haven't we? Don't stay out too long." "I won't, my love," I said. "And yes, we have. Thank you." Well, I strolled out to the front door, left it unlatched, and my God, what a night it was. Jagged masses of heavy cloud were rolling from horizon to horizon, and thin white wreaths covered the stars. Through the rush of this cloud river, the moon swam, breasting the waves and disappearing again in the darkness. And when now and again her light reached the woodlands, they seemed to be slowly and noiselessly waving in time to the swing of the clouds above them. There was a strange grey light over all the earth. The fields had that shadowy bloom over them, which only comes from the marriage of dew and moonshine, or frost and starlight. I walked up and down, drinking in the beauty of the quiet earth and the changing sky. The night was absolutely silent. Nothing was abroad. There was no scurrying of rabbits or twitter of birds. And although the clouds went sailing across the sky, the wind that drove them never came low enough to rustle the dead leaves in the woodland paths. Across the meadows, I could see the church tower standing out, black and grey against the sky. And so I walked over there, thinking of my darling wife and our 3 months of happiness. I heard a bell beat from the church. Guys, it was 11 o'clock already. I turned to go back home, but somehow the night held me. I couldn't go back yet when things are as beautiful as they were. I'd go up to the church. I felt vaguely that it would be good to carry my love and thankfulness to the sanctuary, whither so many loads of sorrow and gladness had been borne by the men and women of dead years. I looked in at the low window of the cottage as I went by. Laura was half lying on her chair in front of the fire. I couldn't see her face, only her hair, which showed dark against the pale blue wall. She was quite still, and I presumed that she was asleep. She was clearly asleep. My heart reached out to her. Well, I walked slowly along the edge of the wood, and then at last something did break the stillness of the night. A rustling in the wood. I stopped and listened, and the sound stopped too. Well, I went on, and now I distinctly heard another step than mine, answering mine like an echo. It was a poacher or a wood stealer, I suppose, but whoever it was, he was a fool not to step more lightly. I turned into the wood, and now the footsteps seemed to come from the path that I'd just left. Must be an echo, I thought. The wood looked perfect in the moonlight. The tree trunks stood up like Gothic columns all around me. They reminded me of the church, in fact, and I turned into the beer balk and passed through the corpse gate between the graves to the low porch. I paused for a moment on the stone seat where Laura and I had watched the fading landscape earlier, and then I noticed that the door of the church was open. And I blamed myself for having left it unlatched the other night. Well, we were the only people who ever cared to visit the building except on Sundays. And, well, I was vexed with myself to think that it was through my carelessness that the damp autumn airs had had a chance of getting in and possibly injuring the old fabric. I went inside. Now, it will seem very strange, perhaps, that I should have gone halfway up the aisle before I remembered Mrs. Dorman's story, and that this was the very day and hour when, according to her, the shapes drawed out man-size in marble began to walk. Having thus remembered the legend, and remembering it with something of a shiver, I admit, I could not do otherwise than walk up towards the altar to look at the carved figures. I mean, really what I wanted was to assure myself, first, that I did not believe the legend, and secondly, that it was not true. I began to, in fact, feel rather glad that I'd come. I thought now that I could tell Mrs. Dorman how vain her fancies were, and how peacefully the marble figures slept on through the ghastly hour. In the grey, dim light, the eastern end of the church looked larger than usual, and the arches above the two tombs looked larger too. And then the moon came out and showed me the reason for this, and my heart gave a leap that almost choked me. The bodies drawn out man-size in marble, were gone. And their marble slabs lay wide and bare in the vague moonlight that slanted through the east window. Were they really gone? No, of course not. Clenching my nerves, I stooped and passed my hand over the smooth slabs and felt their flat, unbroken surface. They weren't there. Well, I had someone taken them away to clean them, perhaps. I mean, was it some weird practical joke? In an instant, I made a torch of a newspaper, which happened to be in my pocket, and I held it high above my head. And its yellow glare illuminated the dark arches and those empty slabs. The figures were gone, and I was alone in the church. Or was I alone? And then a horror seized me, a horror indefinable and indescribable, an overwhelming certainty it was of supreme and accomplished calamity. I flung down the torch and tore along the aisle and out through the porch, biting my lips as I ran to keep myself from shrieking aloud. I leapt the churchyard wall and took the straight cut across the fields, led by the light of our cottage windows. Just as I got over the first stile, a dark figure seemed to spring up out of the ground. And mad still with that certainty of misfortune, I made straight for this thing that stood in my path and shouted, "Get out of my way, damn you!" But my push met with a still more vigorous resistance than I had expected. My arms were caught just above the elbow as if held in a vice. And the doctor shook me. "What are you doing, man?" "Let me go, blast you," I said. "The marble figures have gone from the church. They've gone." "What?" He broke into a ringing laugh. "I'll have to give you a draft tomorrow, I see, Jack. You've been smoking too much and listening to old wives' tales. I tell you, I've seen the bare slabs. They're gone." "Oh, bare slabs, eh?" "Come on then, show me." "What? No, there's no time," I said. I felt a little less frantic for his laughter. I must go back to Laura." "Come on, old man," he said. "What, are you going to go all your life saying that you've seen statues walking and me going all my life telling you you're a liar? Come on, Jack. Let's take a look at this miracle of yours together." Well, the night air, his calm voice, and I think the physical contact did bring me back a little to my ordinary self. "All right," I said. "Perhaps you're right." "Of course I'm right, Jack." We got over the stile and we headed back to the church. All was as still as death. The place smelt damp and earthy. We walked up the aisle, and I'm not ashamed to say that I closed my eyes because I knew that the figures would not be there. I heard Dr. Kelly strike a match. "Well, well, well," he said. "Who'd ever have thought it, Jack? Two very large and very solid marble statues, exactly where they've been for who knows how many hundreds of years." I opened my eyes, and by the doctor's expiring match, I saw two shapes lying in their marble on the slabs. "Oh, thank you, doctor." "Oh dear. Oh God, it must have been some trick of the light. Or perhaps I have been working rather hard. Perhaps that's it. You know, I was utterly convinced that they had gone." "You're going to have to be careful of that brain of yours, Jack," he said, suddenly rather serious. He was leaning over and looking at the right-hand figure, whose stony face was the most villainous and deadly in expression. "But hey," he said, "something has been afoot here. Look, his hand's broken." And so it was. The finger of the knight's left hand had been snapped off. I was certain that it had been perfect the last time that Laura and I had been in there. Oh, well, Jack, perhaps someone did try to remove them after all, said the young doctor. But that wouldn't account for my impression of their having been gone, I objected. No, too much painting and tobacco will account for that well enough. Well, all right, come on. Laura is going to be getting anxious. You'll come in and have a drop of whiskey, won't you? Well, Guy, I ought to go up to Palmer's, but it's so late now. Perhaps I'll just leave it till the morning. All right, I'll come back for a quick whiskey. Just the one, mind you. I think he probably fancied that I needed him more than Palmer did. And so, discussing how such a strange illusion could have been possible and deducing from this experience large generalities concerning ghostly apparitions, we walked back to the cottage. We saw, as we walked up the garden path, that bright light was streaming out of the front door, and we presently saw that the parlour door was open too. Had Laura gone out? Dr. Kelly followed me into the parlour, and it was all ablaze with candles. I mean, not only the wax ones, but at least a dozen guttering, glaring tallow dips, stuck in vases and ornaments in unlikely places. I mean, light, I knew, was Laura's remedy for nervousness, and I felt like a brute for having left her alone for so long. Anyway, at first we didn't see her. The window was open and the draught set all the candles flaring one way, but I could see that her chair was empty and that her handkerchief and book lay on the floor. And then I turned to the window, and there in the recess, oh, my love, had she gone to the window to watch for me? And what had come into the room behind her? God, to what had she turned with that look of frantic fear and horror on her lovely face? God, had she thought that it was I whose step she heard and turned, and she had fallen back across a table in the window, and her body lay half on it and half on the window seat, and her head hung down over the table, the brown hair loosened and fallen to the carpet. Her lips were drawn back, and her eyes were wide, wide open, but they saw nothing now. What had they seen last? The doctor moved towards her, but I pushed him aside and clasped her and kissed her and called her by all the names that I had for her. But I knew all the time that she was dead. Her hands were tightly clenched, and in one of them she held fast onto something. Then I was quite sure that she was dead and that nothing in the world mattered anymore. I let Dr. Kelly open a hand to see what she held. It was a grey marble finger.